Okay, Europe. Immigration. It seems like you really can't avoid these discussions online these days, can you?
No, absolutely not. It's everywhere. And, it's such a complex issue with so many different facets.
Which is exactly why we wanted to dive a bit deeper today.
Right. Because the headlines, well, they often just give you a tiny piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of history
Hmm.
and, frankly, deeply held beliefs underneath it all.
That's what we're trying to unpack here.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're looking at a specific viewpoint on Islamic immigration into Europe. The source material is a transcript from Raymond Ibrahim's YouTube channel. The video is called Treason, who is betraying Europe to Islam.
And it's really important up front to say this is one specific perspective. It's, let's say, a very strongly argued one.
Definitely. Our aim here isn't to agree or disagree, right? It's more about understanding the arguments being made.
Exactly. We want to look at the historical claims, the interpretations of Islamic doctrine that are presented, basically see how this particular viewpoint is constructed.
Okay, so let's get into it. First big theme. The idea that political correctness has made it hard to have open conversations about Islamic immigration in Europe.
Yeah, the argument presented is that this PC environment has really prevented people from getting a clear picture of Islam, especially, its history and doctrines concerning non-Muslims.
Kind of like Islam has been whitewashed. That's the term used.
That's the term used, yeah.
Mhm.
The claim is that the common narrative often smooths over or just ignores parts of Islamic history and theology that this perspective sees as absolutely crucial for understanding what's happening now.
Hmm. Sets the stage, really.
It does, which brings us to the historical side. One big idea challenged is this notion of, centuries of peace between Muslims and Christians.
We do hear that narrative sometimes.
We do, and this source calls it a big fat lie, basically. It argues that instead of harmony, the early centuries of Islam involved, well, rapid and often forceful takeovers of previously Christian areas.
Right, like the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, 7th, 8th centuries.
Exactly. Those examples are used to say, look, this wasn't just some minor friction. This was significant conquest.
Military conquest. And then there's the Battle of Tours, 732. The source mentions alleged atrocities in France, too.
Right. So Tours isn't seen just as Europeans defending themselves, but as a response to major Islamic incursions deep into France, which, according to the source, involved significant violence.
So it paints a picture of continuous conflict, really, not peace.
That's the narrative being built, yes. Conflict and expansion.
And there's a pretty stark example given to back this up. The claim about 30,000 churches being destroyed in Egypt around the year 1009.
Yeah, that's presented as not just some isolated incident, but part of a pattern of persecution that, in this view, actually provoked the Crusades.
So the argument is this destruction was a direct cause, not just a background factor.
Just precisely. It challenges the idea that the Crusades were, totally unprovoked aggression purely from Europe. Yeah. It frames them as a reaction.
Okay, so that's the historical angle laid out in the source. Let's shift to the doctrinal claims. There's this concept, al-wala wal-bara, loyalty and enmity. How's that explained?
Well, the interpretation given is pretty stark. It's presented as a core Islamic doctrine straight from the Quran that actually requires Muslims to hate non-Muslims.
Hate them, not just disagree with them.
That's the claim. A mandated animosity, supposedly even towards family members who aren't Muslim. Now, it's worth noting again, this is strong interpretation. There are other views within Islam on this doctrine.
It sounds extreme. And there's an anecdote used to illustrate this, something about a fatwa.
Yes, from an Egyptian cleric. It concerned Muslim men marrying non-Muslim women. The point being made was that even in a permissible marriage, the husband is supposedly still required, doctrinally, to feel hatred towards his non-Muslim wife.
Wow. And the source argues this isn't just some fringe idea.
Correct. The speaker insists this is Quranic, mainstream, not just, the view of a few radicals. That's the assertion.
Okay. Then there's another doctrine mentioned, taqiyya, dissimulation.
Right, taqiyya. This is explained as a principle allowing Muslims to essentially pretend friendship towards non-Muslims, maybe act like allies, while secretly maintaining that required hatred.
Especially when they're in a weaker position, like as a minority.
Exactly, when they're in a position of weakness. And again, the source emphasizes this is presented as Quranic, not some later invention.
So the implication is, well, that friendly interactions might not be genuine.
That's the implication drawn, yes.
Yeah.
That outward appearances can be deceptive doctrinally permitted deception, according to this view.
Which naturally makes the whole idea of a moderate Muslim complicated.
Very complicated. That's where the source goes next. It essentially calls the term moderate Muslim an oxymoron.
Why an oxymoron?
Because the argument goes, if these core doctrines require hatred and allow for dissimulation, then someone truly following them can't be moderate in the way we usually understand it.
So it distinguishes between, say, secular Muslims or cultural Muslims.
Right, or cafeteria Muslims, who pick and choose. It distinguishes them from someone trying to be a doctrinally faithful and moderate adherent, which this viewpoint suggests is, well, fundamentally contradictory.
Okay. Following that logic, the source then talks about jihad. How is that defined here?
Primarily, it's defined as warfare. Warfare against non-Muslims with the aim of either subjugating them or converting them.
And it's linked back to that idea of inherent hatred.
Yes, directly. It's presented as the practical outcome of this underlying animosity that's allegedly taught from childhood.
The source also mentions a hierarchy of hate and the word kafir. What's that about?
The idea seems to be that while the base requirement is dislike for all non-Muslims, all kafir, there might be, let's say, practical priorities based on who's perceived as the bigger threat at any given time.
And the term kafir itself.
It's highlighted as being much stronger, much more negative in Arabic than just unbelievers or non-Muslim in English. Though, the exact weight and application of kafir has its own complex history in Islamic thought.
But the point being made is that it implies a deep division.
A very deep divide. Yeah.
Even for Christians and Jews, the people of the book. Does that status help in this view?
Not really, according to this source. It acknowledges the category, sure, but argues they're still non-Muslims, still ultimately subject to that required dislike and potentially jihad.
And what about the jizya tax? How does that fit in?
The jizya from Quran 9.29 is presented as the historical tribute non-Muslims had to pay in some Islamic states. It's framed as a symbol of their second-class status, the price for not converting.
Another example of systemic discrimination from this perspective.
That's how it's positioned, yes, rooted in Scripture.
The source also brings up apostasy leaving Islam.
Yes, and it points to the traditional Islamic ruling based on hadith, which prescribes the death penalty for leaving the faith.
Death penalty.
That's the traditional ruling cited. The source does mention there are nuances in how different legal schools might apply it, but the core principle of severe punishment is emphasized.
Okay, shifting focus a bit. Media portrayal. What's the argument about how conflicts involving Muslims are covered?
The claim is that the media often misrepresents things, that it downplays or ignores the religious motivation when Muslims attack non-Muslims, maybe framing it as political instead.
Is there an example given?
Yes. The beheading of the 21 Coptic Christians in Libya back in 2015. The source contrasts the media attention that received with the attention given to the killing of Harambe the guerrilla, suggesting the Christians' deaths got significantly less coverage.
That's a stark comparison, whether you agree with the conclusion or not.
It is. It's used to argue there's a bias against reporting the religious dimension of such violence.
And why? Why would there be this lack of honest conversation, as the source puts it?
Two main reasons are suggested. One is the fear of being called racist, because, the perception is that most Muslims are non-white.
So that chills discussion.
That's the argument. And the second reason proposed is a kind of anti-Christian bias in the West, leading to more sympathy, perhaps, for other religions like Islam.
Right, which leads into some really difficult territory about responsibility.
Yes. The viewpoint here is quite controversial. It argues that Western cultures, by allowing increased Islamic immigration, essentially bear responsibility for the consequences described.
Contrasting it with past resistance.
Exactly, contrasting it with historical periods where Europe actively fought against Islamic expansion. And it highlights the current power imbalance. The West being stronger, now arguing that the West is kind of enabling its own problems through open borders and stifled debate.
Which brings things to a very blunt question posed in the source. Should the West just surrender, given demographic trends?
Yeah, it's framed as a potential outcome. It references Pew Research projections about future Muslim population percentages in Europe. The idea of a formal surrender is even floated.
Like a minority accommodating a majority while suppressing its own culture.
Kind of, yeah. The phrase used is suicidal empathy.
Wow. Okay, so given all this bleak picture, what's the proposed solution from Raymond Ibrahim in the source?
It's very direct. His view is that Western men need to, quote, grow some balls and protect their societies.
So a call for more assertive action.
Yes. He seems to place the main problem not with the Muslim populations themselves, but with European leaders, suggesting they need to be much tougher in confronting these issues he's raised.
Okay, let's try to sum this up. We've gone through this deep dive on the Raymond Ibrahim transcript, and it presents a really specific, very forceful viewpoint.
Definitely. The core arguments are built on interpreting history as primarily conflict, reading Islamic doctrines like al-Wala wal-Bara and Taqiyya as mandating enmity and permitting deception, and analyzing Western society as suppressing honest debate about it all.
Right. We've touched on the historical claims, the views on jihad, kafir, jizya, apostasy, the critique of media coverage, and the reasons given for that lack of open dialogue.
Exactly. And the responsibility argument, the demographic question, and finally that call for assertive leadership. It's a comprehensive, though highly controversial perspective.
It certainly is, and it leaves you, the listener, with a lot to think about. Considering these arguments, what are the ingredients needed for a genuinely informed, honest conversation about these huge cultural and demographic shifts in the West?
Yeah, and what's our individual responsibility? What about our leaders? How do we shape these crucial discussions and ultimately the outcomes? It really does push you to think critically and maybe even go look at some of those historical sources and religious texts yourself to form your own informed view.